Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Ask the Experts 2020, the election edition. My name is Samantha Pelham. I'm a media relations specialist for Ohio University who works heavily with our faculty experts, helping share their expertise with the media and on platforms such as this. So thank you for joining us. Tonight, I have the honor to virtually sit down and talk with two of our wonderful experts about how women have and continue to change the political landscape in the United States. With me tonight is Dr. Jellison and Dr. Sarah Poggione from the College of Arts and Sciences here at Ohio. Welcome, and thank you both so much for taking time out of this hectic and busy time to talk with us this evening. It is really, really appreciated. So let's get started this evening by having each of you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your area of expertise.
Who wants to go first? We can go in alphabetical order. Okay, I'm Catherine Jellison, and I'm a professor of history, and my specialties are U.S. women's and gender history, including women in U.S. politics.
Hi, I'm Sarah Poggione. I'm the Associate Dean for Students, Curriculum, and Instruction in the College of Arts and Sciences, and I'm also a political science professor. My focus is on American politics and quantitative methods, with a specialization in women in politics, particularly at the state level.
Great. Thank you both so much. And now before we get started asking our experts some questions, I do want to invite you as the audience to send us any questions that you may have for our experts as well. You can send these questions through messaging Ohio University on our social channels. All right, well, without further ado, let's get started. Dr. Jellison, excuse me, the first question will be for you.
Okay.
How did the United States women exercise political influence prior to gaining the right to vote?
Okay, well, I should start out by noting that we are celebrating this year the centennial of the 19th Amendment, which most people think of as giving women the right to vote. But actually, in early America, in several of the northeastern colonies and later states, women already had the right to vote. And that was slowly taken away. The last state that took women's right to vote away was New Jersey in 1807. So there was actually a time well before the 19th Amendment of 1920 when women had direct political influence through the vote. But after that right was taken away, we had a variety of ways in which women could influence U.S. politics. My PhD mentor is a woman named Linda Kerber, and she came up with a term called Republican motherhood, which applied to elite white women in the early Republic era. If you think about Abigail Adams, she was probably the quintessential Republican mother. The idea was that a woman could exercise political influence through her role as wife and mother, and particularly with her husband and her sons, talk about politics around the dinner table, instill the so-called Republican virtues, and make sure that men did their proper duty as political players. So it was this idea of Republican motherhood. It wasn't called that in the early Republic. Again, it's in the 20th century that Linda Kerber comes up with this term to describe a way in which elite white women had political influence over their husbands and their sons. A way that non-elite women had political influence before the 19th Amendment was through petitioning. And again, it was women who had some political know-how, but it wasn't only elite women who took advantage of their right to petition. One of my favorite historical characters who was very good at this was an outsider in American life, a Jewish immigrant from Poland named Ernestine Rose. And in the 1830s and the 1840s, she took her right to petition to have people sign petitions in behalf of married women's right to own property in the state of New York, and which is where she was living. Ultimately, in 1848, through her efforts and efforts of names that you probably know better, Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, were also active in this petitioning campaign, getting signatures from men who had direct political power through the vote, getting men's signatures to say, we support a change in the New York law allowing married women to own their own property. And eventually enough legislators received enough of these petitions to change the law in the state of New York. So the power of the petition. Another example, I think, that we should keep in mind is during Reconstruction. Our records from that period say that the most politically engaged and involved people were Black women. They did not benefit from the 15th Amendment, which gave Black men the right to vote. But observers at the time said if you went to any political rally in the Reconstruction South, it was the women who were the most enthusiastic participants in political rallies and meetings. And again, much of it is about encouraging their men to get out and vote, encouraging their men to run for office, and supporting certain candidates and certain causes through speeches, through wearing sashes with slogans on them, through prodding men to follow a particular idea or support a particular candidate or a particular reform. So there were a variety of ways that we see women becoming politically involved and being political influencers long before the 19th Amendment becomes part of the U.S. Constitution.
Great, thank you for that history lesson. It definitely was really informative to me. I didn't even know that the petition was really started from women wanting that, and to think today how petitions are used for so many different people, not just women, but any background. It's very eye-opening to see what women started and how that's carrying today to help even more people. So my next question is also for you, going with this little idea of the history behind it. How did the adoption of the 19th Amendment in August of 1920 change U.S. women's political status?
Well, I think it's really important to realize that not all women were given the right to vote with the 19th Amendment, which is 1920, as you say. For instance, I'll just sort of go chronologically. Native American women, American Indian women, weren't even given citizenship for another 4 years with the Indian Citizenship Act of 1924. So Native American women didn't have the right to vote automatically in 1920. And because, here's a little civics lesson too, our voter laws and rules occur on the state level. So even after American Indians became citizens in 1924, certain states had restrictions equivalent to the Jim Crow restrictions on Black voters in the South that prevented American Indians in some states really from having their full voting rights until as late as 1948, so after World War II. We see that Asian immigrant women didn't get the right to vote with the 19th Amendment because they couldn't qualify to become citizens until well past World War II in most instances. Chinese immigrants, men and women, were granted the right to become naturalized citizens during World War II in 1943 because the Chinese were our allies in the war, and it looked pretty bad to say, we won't let people from one of our allied countries, if they immigrate from there, become citizens. So that change was made in 1943. In 1946, immigrants from South Asia were granted the right to become naturalized citizens, and so women from that region of the world who immigrated to the U.S. could have a pathway toward becoming voters. And then in 1952, East Asians, in addition to the Chinese immigrants, Koreans and Japanese immigrants. And then, of course, African American women and men, after the Reconstruction period ended, had their voting rights and other civil rights taken away through the Jim Crow laws. And so it's not until 1965, a good 45 years after the 19th Amendment becomes part of the U.S. Constitution, that Black women and men in the South really had permanent rights to vote. Also, I should point out that there were state level laws in many places that also prevented Hispanic folks from voting, similar again to the laws in the Deep South that prevented Black citizens from voting. So it's erroneous to say that the 19th Amendment gave all adult women the right to vote in the U.S. It gave white adult women the right to vote. And in terms of the long-term impact of the 19th Amendment and the subsequent changes that I outlined that allowed a larger and larger and larger group of women by the time we get to 1965 to have full voting rights. It's not the case that women become a voting bloc until a full 60 years after the 19th Amendment. We don't see the so-called gender gap develop until around 1980. And of course, I think we all know what I mean by the gender gap, that women gravitating more to the Democratic Party and men to the Republican Party. It's in 1980, the year of the so-called Reagan Revolution, that the Republican Party changes its platform in a couple of significant ways. It no longer has a pro-choice stance and is no longer pro-equal rights amendment. And the Democrats continue to support both those issues. And I think, and it would be interesting to get Sarah's take on this, I think at first glance, people thought, oh, women are just leaving the Republican Party. They're really gravitating to the Democrats. But it was more so that men were leaving the Democrats and going to the Republicans, white men. And again, to a great extent, Southern white men who had already been leaving the Democratic Party after the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which had been supported by a Democratic president, a Democratic Congress, and white Southern men particularly said, hey, the Democrats are the Black voters' party now. We're going to leave for the Republicans. And President Nixon had his so-called Southern strategy that then President Reagan also rode that same wave. And so the Republican Party siphoned off a lot of white men who were already heading in that direction after the Voting Rights Act of 1965. But with these changes in the Republican platform in 1980, it accelerated that change. And so we have the so-called gender gap. Previous to 1980, women tended to vote pretty much like the men they were closest to. Factors of race and class and region, philosophy of government, all played a role. But, women tended to vote like their husbands, their brothers, their fathers. We only really see this differentiation according to gender beginning in the 1980s, and then you are living through a very interesting time, Samantha, where we see that gap growing even greater here in the Trump era. So that's my quick history of how the 19th Amendment did or did not change the role of women in politics.
Thank you. Yeah, that all was extremely a great history lesson that I hope we all take with us something from, especially the fact that, when you think that, 1965 was not long ago in perspective, it really wasn't. And so that's, very sad to think about as it is, and to think about this this gap that's happening, and especially you say that in this Trump era, how interesting it is. Sarah, would you like to talk a little bit about this as well and comment on, this gender gap and maybe from the 1980s to today, or even how it is today?
Yeah, so Catherine's exactly right. We really saw the really first big evidence of the gender gap in the 1980 election with Ronald Reagan. And typically that was about an 8 percentage point gender gap where women were more likely to favor the Democratic candidate than men were. And it really was at that point that public opinion scholars and folks who looked at public opinion surveys really started to look for and see gender differences, not just in people's voting behavior, but also in their political preferences. And we started to see then differences in men and women's preferences on policy. And so it's interesting that it looks like there weren't very significant differences before that. And then there were that issues were more important, not unilaterally, but more important to women and men, and even their opinions on those issues differentiated a bit, with women tending to have more moderate and more liberal views on some social issues, and usually more moderate and liberal views on crime and penalties, and men having a bit more conservative opinions on some of those issues as well. And then the gender gap really sort of hit its highest point really in the 1996 election with Bill Clinton, where it favored Bill Clinton, leading to his victory. And also was actually also an 11%, also the high point gender gap, in 2016. Where it favored Hillary Clinton, did not lead right to her victory. But of course, we had very close elections in both cases. It's important to note, though, while the gender gap is considerable, right, and while it's important, we also know that the Electoral College dictates, right, presidential winners. And so it's where votes are, right, that also makes a big difference in who we see as the ultimate victor. But generally, if we see those large gender gaps, it tends to really make things very competitive and tends to advantage Democratic candidates. Women are also somewhat more likely to vote than men. So that means that large gender gaps may also advantage Democratic candidates in that as well. So that's some of the things that we see about the gender gap and some of those preferences. And we see also, again, consistently seeing differences in men and women's preferences. Now, they're not as big as differences if we look at party. So there's bigger differences between what Democrats and Republicans think on average about policy issues than there are between women and men. But even if you look within Democrats and within Republicans and within independents, we see that there are significant gender differences on issues, sometimes issues of crime and punishment, sometimes issues of healthcare policy, education, social welfare policy, defense, some of these issues.
Thank you.
Sure.
And I will put in this shameless plug that you said women are more likely to vote than men.
They are.
Everyone needs to vote. This is my shameless plug to tell you to get out and vote. Whoever you are, whatever you identify as, vote. Anyway,
yes,
next question for you as well. So talking about this gender gap and the influence, how does the gender influence campaigns and elections when it comes to a woman being the person who is potentially elected? In the case in 2016, Hillary Clinton, and, of course, we have Kamala Harris as vice president nominee or vice president candidate for this election. So how are there advantages and disadvantages to having women?
Yeah, one of the interesting things about this is for a long time, folks thought that female candidates were disadvantaged in elections. And that was sort of the normal take that folks had through the 1970s. And to some extent, that was the case. Women were seen as unusual, as anomalies. We sometimes talk in political science about the social eligibility pool. And these are not the real eligible people who could run for office, because really in the U.S. context, at least in the modern context, there aren't really a lot of requirements for folks to run for office. However, to be a serious and credible candidate, it helps to look like other folks who hold that office, right? And so if there's very few women in government, if there's very few people of color in government, if there's very few people who are LGBT identified in government, it makes it harder then for folks that represent that way to be seen as credible candidates. And so it was seen that being a woman was really a disadvantage, and that was something that women candidates had to overcome. They had to be better than their colleagues, right, in some ways. Throughout the 80s, we saw some of that. The gender gap changed a little bit of that to some extent. But I think one of the biggest factors was as we saw more women slowly break their way into state legislatures, into local government politics, into the U.S. House, and then eventually into the U.S. Senate. We really did see it was more regular to think about female candidates. And we saw that really there are advantages and disadvantages to being a female candidate. It's not just all disadvantages, right? In fact, the National Election Studies used to ask folks if they would consider voting for a qualified candidate who was female for their party for president. And we used to see percentages of people saying they would, 80, 90. It started to top out at 98, 99%. And so they just stopped asking the question, right? However, we still know that voters evaluate male and female candidates differently. So one of the interesting things is that voters tend to give female candidates more competency. They rate them as better on particular sets of issues, social welfare issues, education issues, healthcare issues. They tend to rate male candidates better on tax policy, on defense, on crime. However, what's really interesting is that when women's campaigns really focus on tax policy, on defense, on crime, voters do react, and they do rate those candidates better on those as well. And those women still get the advantage, right, of being good on healthcare, good on welfare, good on education policy. So part of this is interesting because it means that the issues that are really prevalent in the election, in that election cycle, can really advantage women at some points in time and maybe advantage men at other points in time, right? So it's not necessarily always an advantage or disadvantage, and it might even change by year depending on the issues that we're really concerned with. So I think that's kind of an interesting factor. In addition, one of the things that I find really interesting is that women are seen as, female candidates are seen by voters as more ethical on average. More focused on their constituency concerns, less motivated by trying to sort of gather power and influence, right? Now, I'm not saying whether those things are necessarily true, but those are attributes that voters tend to give female candidates. And so that could be an advantage depending, again, on the election. I think 2016 was really interesting because if we think that that might have been a potential advantage for a female presidential candidate, one of the things that President Trump, then the candidate, really worked to do was to sort of, I think, cast some real doubt on that sort of possible ethical advantage. And so obviously there was, some situations that they could point to so that they could maybe not so much say that this person was worse or better, but really negate any potential advantage there might be there. So the strategies for folks running against male and female candidates might be a little bit different too, if you're thinking about kind of the way voters tend to perceive them.
Interesting. Thank you.
Sure.
And kind of going off of this, I have a question for both of you that I think you can both answer is, does gender influence how elected officials do their jobs? And I know oftentimes, sometimes you hear, or it's been trending on social media about how people have said women are too emotional to be in elected political position. And I personally find that very absurd. So kind of how does gender influence that? And what is your take on when people say that or that, trending idea that people have often shot down as not true?
Right. Well, I think you're right. It is a notion that some folks have, that women would be somehow ill-equipped for politics because of some sort of emotional component. I don't think that's true, and research suggests that it's not, right? And one of the interesting things is, though, if you're combating that, there's a difference then. Women would run a greater risk by appearing to be upset, right? So you might see that a white male candidate might be able to get angry, and that's not read as emotional or upset. That's righteously indignant, right? But a woman might have to be more careful about appearing angry, because then that might trigger that upset comment, which usually reads as, overly emotional. So women candidates might be more likely to sort of stay the even keel, try to be unflappable in a situation in some ways in order to mitigate some of those critiques that women tend to face.
I think that's probably correct. I think it will be interesting to see the vice presidential debate, excuse me, and just based on past debate performance, I think that is something that Kamala Harris definitely, that's the persona that she projects is, I'm unflappable, I'm in charge here, I will not get emotional. And, that I put myself in her place, and that can be very difficult, I'm sure, in many instances. And yet, as Sarah said, if a male candidate would get angry if his opponent said something, it would be more likely to be perceived as righteous indignation. But so I think, female candidates still have to work to overcome that misperception that some people, as we said, have.
And I think for Senator Harris, being a woman of color, being a Black woman, that's even a higher hurdle. And so you can see that she has just a tremendous amount of poise. That's part of her political persona. And, she's going to be calm and unflappable, but still try to find a way to reach voters and connect with them, and still be ride this very difficult line. Being enthusiastic, being charismatic, being sympathetic, being compassionate, but also being in control.
Well, we do have.
Sorry.
No, go ahead. Continue, please.
I was just thinking that certainly there's a different way that women do their jobs when they're in elected office. One of the things that research tells us is that women are more likely to engage in collaborative leadership. So they have a different leadership style. Now, again, not across the board. You can think of exceptions. And also the kind of position you're in dictates your kind of leadership position, the problems you're facing, what works, right? Leaders, regardless of their gender, are going to be strategic and smart and use the tools at their disposal. However, we do have significant research that says that women are a bit more collaborative. And in some situations, that could lead to you being much more successful, right? Particularly if you're dealing with party divisions or divisions in your party. If you're at a very tight, party control of your legislative institution or your house or your chamber, then you need all of your party on board. So how do you do that? How do you negotiate? How do you make that work, right? So we know that that's another way that they do their jobs a little bit differently. And then also policy. I mean, elections are very interesting, but to me, they're an ends to a means, or I'm sorry, they're a means to an end, excuse me, and that is they're really about public policy. And we know that men and women, again, have different policy priorities when they're in elected office and have different policy preferences. And so that, I think, is one of the ways where we've really seen that women in elected office make real contributions to government. They focus on different sets of issues. They brought up issues that we didn't used to think of childcare, right, as a social and political issue, was a personal problem that families faced, right? And they had to figure it out. But no, women brought that up as, no, that is in fact a public problem, right? Availability of childcare. We're seeing that again right now with the pandemic, right? So those are issues that women have brought to the forefront. If you think of women of color right now, they're bringing issues about voting rights, right? As Catherine talked about, even though the right to vote was there were discriminatory practices and laws that made it impossible for Black Americans, for Hispanic and Latino Americans, for Native Americans and American Indians to actually exercise their right to vote. And today, it's still difficult, right, in certain communities. It's still difficult for Black citizens in some places to exercise their rights to vote. It's still difficult for people with disabilities to exercise their rights to vote. And so you do see Black women elected officials and Black women activists really at the forefront of pushing on those issues and making positive changes.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, thank you. So we have our first question from one of our audience viewers. Elena on Facebook asks you both, what's the most surprising fact about women in politics that you can tell us?
Oh, hi. Surprising surprising fact.
Oh, surprising
Not
fact.
making it
Well, one that I can say is that women make up over half the voting electorate, over half of the voting electorate, right? And we make up, ladies, less than 24% of the U.S. Congress. So that is we are at record numbers of representation in Congress right now. So this is actually a positive thing, but it's still significant underrepresentation of women in elected office. So that to me is something that we should be a little surprised and maybe a little appalled by, and keep working for that parity, right? At some point.
Okay, that reminded me of a surprising fact, which is that you can look at U.S. women's political history in 72-year cycles. Oh my goodness. 72 years between major developments. So our nation is founded in 1776. All men are created equal, right? In the Declaration of Independence. 72 years later, at the Seneca Falls Convention, we have the Declaration of Sentiments, where Elizabeth Cady Stanton says all men and women are created equal. And the major demand in that important document at this first U.S. women's rights meeting is the demand for the right to vote. So 72 years from Jefferson. By the way, I'm wearing my suffrage t-shirt that has a suffragist writing the word women in here. And the ghost of Thomas Jefferson is looking over her shoulder. And so she's writing the word women. All men and women are created equal. Anyway, so we get to Seneca Falls 72 years after the Declaration of Independence. And then it's 72 years after Seneca Falls when we have the 19th Amendment. And so women's voting rights become part of the Constitution. And then if you take it another 72 years, we get to the year 1992, which was the so-called Year of the Woman, when we had record number of women running for office and being elected to office in the wake of the confrontation between Anita Hill and Clarence Thomas over his confirmation to be part of the Supreme Court. And of course, she brought up her allegations of sexual harassment against him, and many women tuned into those hearings and saw an all-male, all-white, and all-male Senate Judiciary Committee questioning Anita Hill, and said, there's something wrong with this picture. So when I think about U.S. women's political history being in 72-year cycles, will it be another 72 years, Sarah, after 1992, when we finally have parity in Congress, for instance, with half the members of Congress being female and half male, or maybe even better than that, a true democracy where if women make up the majority of the population and the majority of the voting population, they would be represented with more than 50% of the seats in Congress. So
I did not know the 72-year cycle. That's very interesting. I hope we can break that. Maybe cut it in half and just start cutting it in half for the next.
Like 72 years is a long time.
Yeah, it is literally a lifetime, as the actuarial scientists will tell you. Yes.
Right.
We do have another question from a Facebook user as well. Who are some of the earliest, most notable and impactful women in politics?
Do you want to take that first, Sarah, or?
Well,
I mean,
I'm going to let you start that one.
Well, I would just say, I mentioned her before, which is Abigail Adams, and her famous "Remember the Ladies" letter that she wrote from her farm in Braintree, Massachusetts, to her husband in Philadelphia at the time that the Continental Congress is about to, as she put it in her letter, declare an independency. And as I said before, she would be the ultimate Republican mother, always encouraging her husband, a future president, and her son, a future president, to be involved politically and to make sure they were reading the right things. And but when she made her plea to remember the ladies, sometimes people misinterpret that and say she was asking for the right to vote. No, she was asking that this British common law tradition known as coverture be done away with, which was the idea that a married woman didn't have a civil identity. So she couldn't own property, she couldn't make contracts, she couldn't be the legal guardian of her child. But that's one thing they didn't get around to in declaring an independency. We continued for many decades to have intact that idea of coverture, that a man's civil identity in civil law covered his wife as well. And for instance, that New York married women's property law that I mentioned before of 1848 was one of the state level laws that begins overturning that idea of coverture. So she was a very well-read woman. She was very opinionated and was not shy about sharing her opinions. And as I said, she really, given the realities of her society, including the idea that coverture is still the law of the land even after independence, she did what she could in her role as wife and mother to have a political influence. So she's someone who immediately comes to mind to me.
Well, thank you for giving me a second. Well, I would say one person that I can think of would be Shirley Chisholm. And Shirley Chisholm in 1968 was the first African-American woman to be elected to the U.S. Congress. And in 1972, she was the first woman to run for a major party nomination for president. And despite being severely underfinanced, she did receive 10% of the votes and did make it to the convention floor. But one of the things I think that's really most interesting about her is I did at one point have the chance to meet her. And wow. I know, it was amazing. So that was at the Center for American Women in Politics, which I just have to plug them because they're amazing. And so I had a chance to meet her and talk a little bit with her. And one of the things that she would talk about is when she ran for Congress in ran for the presidential nomination of the Democratic Party in 1972. Secret Service, she was assigned Secret Service agents because obviously her life was being threatened. There would be Klan protesters outside speeches where she would be making campaign speeches. And she said, as long as they didn't disrupt things, they could be there. And in fact, when the Klan protesters came in to the convention hall to actually attend her speech, a lot of folks wanted her to not permit them. And she said they were permitted as long as they did not disrupt things. And then at the end of her speech, she had a receiving line. And one of the Klan members got up and was moving through the receiving line to shake her hand. Mm-hmm. And she said she would, but he had to take off his hood.
Oh, my gosh.
And he did. And she said he was very young and shaking. And he shook her hand. He couldn't say a word, but he shook her hand. And so I think she really believed that you can change things. Winning the presidency, of course. Did she want to? Yes. Was she a serious contender? Yes. Did she still make a difference? Yes. Right. So one doesn't have to win the nomination or the presidency to still make a difference. She did that day in and day out. And of course, with her work in the U.S. Congress as well. So I think it's important to remember that there's lots of different ways that people affect politics and make change. And so she's always sort of a great example of that. And she always said that she wanted to be remembered as a woman who dared to be a catalyst for change. And so I think, that's a good thing to think about, right? We have some great folks that we can think about that are inspirational. And to me, she's one of them.
Am I allowed to tell a Shirley Chisholm story?
Yes, everyone has a Shirley Chisholm story.
and now everyone who's listening to me will know how old I am. When I say, when she ran for president in 1972, I was in 6th grade, and I got very inspired. Hey, a woman's running for the presidency. And I took the back of my tablet, my school tablet, the cardboard back, and with my pencil, and I don't know if I used any crayons or not, maybe it was all in pencil, I drew a Shirley Chisholm for president poster and put it up on the chalkboard shelf next to me. And the boy who sat in front of me, his name was David Dilley, probably still is David Dilley, said, "What is that? Who is this Shirley Chisholm?" And I said, "Her name is Shirley Chisholm." And he said, "Oh, I've got this great game we can play. You take your poster and wave it around, and I try to poke it with my pencil." And as I've told some students in the past, that's the moment I became a feminist. So,
I was going to ask, was that the moment you became a feminist, or the moment you decided to go into politics and women in politics?
Yeah. Actually, sorry to go too much down memory lane, but that is the same year. Yeah, I really decided to become a U.S. women's historian because we had an assignment that year in 6th grade that each of us was supposed to choose a famous person born in February and write an essay about that person. And it couldn't be Washington and it couldn't be Lincoln.
Okay.
Right? Because everyone knew that those two people were born in February. And so there was this long list that our teacher gave us, and there were only 2 women on it. One was Susan B. Anthony, and the other was Marian Anderson. And so I knew I was going to choose one of the women, so I chose Susan B. Anthony. And then what is so interesting is that as I sit here in my office at OU, not too far away from where I'm sitting right now is sort of that, I always call it the wall of fame on the side of Templeton Blackburn Memorial Auditorium. It has those brass plaques or bronze plaques, I guess, for famous people who visited Ohio University or Athens. And both those women who were on that 6th grade list of famous people born in February are commemorated on that wall, Susan B. Anthony and Marian Anderson. But yeah, so I guess that essay I wrote about Susan B. Anthony in 6th grade was my first my first piece of scholarship about U.S. women's history.
Oh, that's great. I love hearing how people get started, and what inspiring in so many different ways. So talking about women who, have made such an impact that are a little more historical, who would you both say are women who are really, leading in politics today? Clearly we have Kamala Harris and AOC, but, some of us who are not always so in tune or familiar with politics, who would you suggest are some women we should really be, following the policies they're advocating for or implementing, and women who are truly stepping up to make change today?
I'll let Sarah go first because I've dominated the conversation the last few minutes, and that gives me time to think.
That's okay. Well, I think we're really seeing lots of important contributions, but one person that I'm really impressed with is Stacey Abrams. I think really focusing on voting rights, on the obstacles that people face, on the obstacles that people of color, that Black voters in particular face, obstacles that are sometimes by the localities they live in, right? Obstacles that are sometimes prevalent in certain states or urban areas, and in fact, state laws, right? State laws that have made voter ID requirements much more difficult for voters and folks, right? So some of the most stringent voter ID laws we have gone into effect. And so I think, working on those issues, thinking about, again, not saying that we don't need to safeguard elections, of course we do, But again, some of those laws seem to be designed to make it more difficult. We know that if you put more obstacles, if you sort of raise the costs of voting in terms of time, then it's much harder for people with for more limited means. It's much harder for women, and it's much harder for people of color to vote. So if you end up having to go out and then you're missing some material and then you have to come back, the idea that you're going to be able to do that is more limiting, right? Again, it's easier if you have more means. It's easier if you can take time off whenever you want to from work. It's easier if you don't have to rely on public transportation. Having once made the decision to vote in person in a presidential election with a baby in Florida, in Miami, I never did that again, right? Because after a few hours, I was like, this was not a good choice, Sarah. This was a bad choice. I'm stuck here. And my child is crying, but it is what it is, right? But I think, subsequently, I've been able to make other choices and sacrifice the historic moment of voting on election day in person to vote early, to do various things. And so, I think, though, if it's a little bit more difficult for you to navigate that in advance, that can be much harder. So I think Stacey Abrams is doing amazing work in really sort of highlighting and working on voting rights and on making sure that we really do protect the civil right of voting, that everybody has the ability to do that. And we know that we're better at this than we were, right? But still, we have a long way to go to really protect the civil rights of voting.
Stacey Abrams is a great answer. I think she is so impressive and fearless. She is someone who takes no guff off anyone, and I really admire her. Someone I was thinking of was Tammy Duckworth, and I don't think we've seen the last of her either. She is another person who's very brave. As a politician. Of course, she's a senator from Illinois, but she's a veteran, a wounded veteran, and is, I think, the first U.S. senator to have a baby while sitting in the U.S. Senate, not literally sitting in the U.S. Senate, but she had the baby, but that is the first sitting U.S. senator to have a baby while in office. And I think she is an amazingly brave, ambitious person. I think I have a feeling she won't stop at being a U.S. senator, and I can see her easily on a ticket, for president or vice president in the future. She's someone who impresses me.
And that's a great example as well, because members of the House are allowed. There's more women in the House, and historically there has been more women in the House in the U.S. House. Members of the House are allowed to take their children onto the floor of the House if they're going to vote. Members of the Senate are not. So basically, she was forbidden to bring children to the floor. If you take maternity leave, you can't introduce new legislation or vote. And so she knew taking time off wasn't an option. And the issue is, how she was going to cast her vote with a newborn baby. And so if she wasn't allowed on the floor, what could she do? So she changed the rules.
Yeah.
Right? And then people were telling, oh, you can go to the Senate cloakroom. And no, she's going to do this, right? Yeah. And so it's just, she did, right? She changed the Senate. I think part of this is called changing
the title of what we're doing here.
Yeah, I lost the word. It's a little late for me, right? But really changing the shape of American politics, right? She did that. She changed what the Senate floor looked like, right? And to have someone with a disability, to have someone who's a veteran, to have someone who's a parent of a young child in the Senate, that's really significant, right? That's really significant. To have a woman of color as well, right? So that's really significant. So I think, she's also a great example. We're good at this, Catherine.
We ought to have our own show.
I know. I was like, let's start this.
Let's do this every Thursday.
I think these folks on social media have some really good questions here, so y'all keep them coming.
I know, right? Right now, we're looking at about 2 more questions until we have to wrap this up, but ladies, I could talk with you all night. This is great. So here, I'll give you guys my last 2 questions here soon. So I'll start this first one off with, it has been extremely saddening that Ruth Bader Ginsburg recently passed away. She was a wonderful woman is an understatement for her. So can you both just give, a little brief information and express, what she's done for women, just to give our audiences a little more idea of how truly she changed women in politics, in honor of her passing recently.
You want to go first?
Sure.
Okay.
Oh,
I'll
sorry.
let you.
Oh, me. Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you were going first.
Oh, no. Hey, we thought we had a good show going here.
I know. I
We're
kind of
missing
messed that one up. Yeah, I mean, there's so many things that women are able to do now because of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Also, she was, she was an influential justice, right? So she had a lot of influence on decisions. She had a lot of influence through dissents and a lot of influence through majority opinions. So, really, she was an influential justice on really sets of women's issues, right? On feminist issues, on things of concern. So this is not my main area, but yes. And I think also she was very inspirational to people, right? Her life, her partnerships, it was just sort of inspirational to see someone navigate it this way, to see someone use their fierce intellect this way to advance the things that they cared about, and then to serve on the U.S. Supreme Court with, distinction.
I think Sarah's frozen up, but I could go ahead and talk while we resolve that. I think, we've been talking a lot about biography when we talk about Tammy Duckworth or Stacey Abrams. But talking about Ruth Bader Ginsburg's biography, that going to law school at a time when it was unusual for women to do that, being a married woman with children as a law student, and then a young law graduate, not having an opportunity to join a law firm as an attorney. She was told, you could come in and be a legal secretary, but we don't hire women lawyers. And her level of energy, her children said, she doesn't sleep much. We know how she was a physical fitness nut. She was always working out. She was so focused and so, frankly, dedicated to be the best Ruth Bader Ginsburg she could be. I'm going to spend every minute doing something useful. If you saw, the documentary about her, her kids were saying, do you think she knows how to turn on her television? Would she know how to do that? Yeah, because, she's not like me, occasionally, it's time for a Leave It to Beaver rerun. Got to take that time and do. No, that would not be a Ruth Bader Ginsburg. But she was, in terms of her career as an attorney, she was truly dedicated to equal rights for men and women. And that meant not just advocating that women have opportunities that they were denied, like, for instance, coverture, in some form or fashion continues well into the lifetime of Sarah and me anyway. In the 1970s, in some states, married women couldn't get credit in their own names. And, she was someone who fought laws like that. But she also fought for male spouses of female veterans to get the same spousal benefits as women who were married to male veterans. And so I think we do talk about her as a feminist, and we talk about her in terms of women's rights, but that also means, equal rights are equal rights. There are some ways that are archaic, oftentimes our archaic legal system discriminates against men with this idea that, oh, well, a veteran's automatically a man and the spouse is automatically a woman. And in the famous case that she was involved in, here was a young widower whose veteran wife had passed away, and he was raising a son, and he wanted the deceased wife's veterans benefits, to financially help him raise his son.
Right.
And she challenged laws that had prevented that. So she was an amazing person.
Thank you. Yeah, I asked because, she really did pave the way for not just women, but like you said, equality. And especially today, I think that's extremely important to bring up. So our last question here, to an extent, also talks about equity and equality, but, more about representation. So can you both please talk on the importance of women, especially those who fall within minority groups, being represented all throughout the political system? We are seeing all these new women who are have all these different backgrounds coming into politics, and I feel like representation, like you said earlier in our conversation, is extremely important, because when you see someone achieving that and working for you, it makes you feel like you can do that. So if you can both, kind of end tonight's discussion talking about the representation of women and those of minority, that'd be great. Thank you.
Sure. So one of the things I think that's really important about representation is, first of all, the symbolic piece, right? When you see folks who look like you, when you see folks who have characteristics that you have, when you see folks of your background, when you see folks, and that could be your ethnic background, your racial background, that could be folks who share your experience as being, of being a veteran, that could be folks who share your identity in terms of LGBT status, right? When you see folks who share characteristics with you, one, know that it's possible, right? That you could end up there as well. You have a chance at that, right? That's really helpful. That's really a good thing to promote. More folks can be involved and participate. You tend to see the system as more legitimate, right? Because people like you are involved in it, right? Mm-hmm. In addition, we use a representative process. We basically don't have a direct democracy, right? We have these folks who represent our interests, and so they're part of the conversation. So yes, we need folks. We need variety among women. It's not enough to have a woman or a woman of color. We need a variation, right? We need women who represent different racial and ethnic backgrounds, who represent different ages, who represent different kinds of family statuses, who come from different occupations and careers before they went into politics, who have different family situations, right? We need folks with this diversity in office because we need those views represented. We need them to be part of the conversation so we can make good collective decisions, right? If we don't even know that their interests are being affected, if we don't even know what their preferences might be, if we don't even know how this would affect them, we're not going to make really good decisions. So I think, to have better policy, to make better governmental decisions, we really need all those voices to be heard. I think that's critical.
I couldn't say it any better than Sarah has. So I'll go back to a historical moment. Reconstruction, the most passionate political players, even though they didn't have the right to vote, were the Black women in the Reconstruction South. And we know today our most enthusiastic and reliable voters are this nation's Black women. That is one example of women of color who have always been politically active, to the extent that the barriers were eradicated, that they could be political players. And so I do think it's a wonderful thing to see so many of these passionate voters now becoming candidates themselves. And that was in the 2018 election, to see so many women of color, Black women, Native American women, Latinas, Asian American women, Muslim women from various backgrounds elected. I mean, the amazing diversity of women elected to the U.S. Congress, the House of Representatives in 2018, and so many women this year, women of color running for office. It's really wonderful to see.
And I will say there's one part, we're at 7, but there's one part where women still fall behind in political participation. And that is, we are less likely to donate to campaigns than men. And women candidates may still find it a little harder to raise money. So for folks who can, be politically active in whatever way you can, working for candidates you care about, thinking about running for office, certainly voting, right? Talking to your friends and colleagues. And, if you have resources to donate to a campaign, even small amounts, those can really add up, and that might change what Congress looks like and who it represents. So,
very
great. Yeah, I'd say we have to end on that note, Well, thank you both from the bottom of my heart for being here and talking with us. This is an extremely important topic, and it's surrounding the election. Women want to have their voice out there heard too. And so I think having the historical perspective and hearing about representation is really informative and important. So again, thank you so much. For those who are still watching in our audience, if you have any other questions regarding women in politics, please feel free to put them in our comments, send us a direct message, and we will pass those questions along to these wonderful experts who have been so gracious to give their time this evening, and we will get those answers back to you. So again, thank you so much, and have a good evening.
Thanks.
Thanks.